Hello, everyone. This is Aida, and on behalf of Safebridge and 451 Research, which is now a part of S&P Global Market Intelligence, I would like to welcome you and say thank you for attending today's webinar titled Managing Through Uncertainty, Gaining Confidence in Your Cybersecurity Strategy Throughout Continuous Security Validation. Before we get started today, there are a few housekeeping items that we need to go over. To ask a question, simply type it in the question box on your screen. We will get to as many as we can during the Q&A session. The presentation slides are available for download in the resources section in the console. And finally, the on-demand version of this roundtable will be available shortly after the live event concludes. We welcome our speakers today, and with that, I'll leave it to Mark.
Very good. Thanks, Ida. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So I'm Mark here. I'm a senior consulting analyst with 451 Research, which is part of S&P Global Market Intelligence. What I'm going to do is I'll give you a little bit of my background, and I'll turn it over to Itzik and Bob to talk about their background as well. So I've been in security about 20 years. This is my second go-around as an industry analyst. I was also with IBM for 12 years, where I was a QRadar SIM product manager, as well as I was a leader in the global sales enablement for their security organization. And we were just talking a little bit too. I'm probably pushing about 40 years in the business. So I've done everything from application development to consulting, and as I mentioned, industry analysis and all sorts of other things. So that's my background. Anyway, I'll turn it over to Itzik, and you can talk about your background.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mark. Hi, everybody. My name is Itzik Cutler, and I'm the CTO and co-founder of Safebridge. I've been in information security for well over 15 years now. I've done anything from development of actual exploits to vulnerability management to managing teams off. And of course, as the CTO of Safebridge, I'm also running the Safebridge Labs, which is powering our platform with the offensive content for our customers. With that being said, I'll pass it to Bob.
Thank you, Itzik. Bob Bigman, also 40 years. It's good to meet someone else who's been in 40 years of IT. My 40 years has all been in cybersecurity, mostly in defensive cyber, a few years in offensive cyber in the U.S. government. I retired in 2012, and I'm an international cybersecurity consultant for companies and government agencies around the world on cyber risks, primarily helping them understand what they need to do to prevent Russian and Chinese sophisticated hacking. But I also work with companies on all sorts of issues, including ransomware. So thank you.
Fabulous. So just a couple of additional housekeeping items. One of the things I really like about this format is it's much more informal. It's a panel style rather than just, bludgeoning you to death with PowerPoint slides. So what we'll do is the general format is going to be, we're going to ask you all a poll question, and there's going to be 3 of those. So if you will do us a favor of answering those questions when they pop up, and we've got one coming up right after this slide. And then that will dovetail into a data point, which we have brought out of our 451 Research knowledge base. As many of you probably know, we do a lot of syndicated research where we, and we've been doing this for over a decade, where we'll survey hundreds of IT and security decision makers and get some really, really interesting data points. So what the format's going to be is we'll ask you your opinion on that data point, then I'll show you our data, and then we'll open up for discussion. So I'll sort of give you my perspective on that data, and then we'll let Itzik and Bob chime in whenever they'd like to. As far as questions, we will definitely get to questions at the end, but I'm going to keep an eye on the Q&A panel as we're going through this. So if you have a question that's germane to the topic, I'd prefer that we discuss it at the time that we're on the topic. So if you want to go ahead and just put it in any time, but especially while we're talking about that topic, then I'll see if we can't get to it while we're talking on that particular topic. And as I mentioned, we are recording this, and we'll make the slides available too if you'd like them. So, okay, moving right along. So we're going to move into the first poll. I'll give you, 60 seconds or whatever it takes for everybody to answer it. The first and the third questions, you can pick more than one option, and then the second question, you can pick only one option. It should be pretty intuitive. So here we go. All right, so this one is just asking your opinion on what the top security strategic objectives will be for 2022 and 2023. And you've got options there, including improving risk and vulnerability assessment or management, and go ahead and start answering if you'd like. Implementing or improving security analytics and monitoring, automation of common security tasks, improving incident response, building and staffing the security team, as well as securing emerging architectures, particularly the cloud. And I'll give you guys another 30 seconds or so to answer that. And we'll go from there. Okay, that's probably pretty good. All right, so let's look at the results there. All right, so it looks like it was a tie between improving risk and vulnerability assessment or management, implementing and improving security analytics, and building and staffing the security team, which makes sense. So now let's look at what our data showed. Now keep in mind that in this poll, we also allowed people to pick more than one, so it's going to add up to more than 100%. So as you can see, a lot of them were very close. The number one response was improving risk and vulnerability assessment or management, which makes sense. That's kind of a general category, but vulnerabilities and risks are very, of course, closely tied, and the management of those continues to be an issue, and that, of course, dovetails into so many other topics, which we'll talk about. Ransomware as an example, and implementing improving security analytics was another big one. And the ones that are kind of blue bars are the ones that we're going to kind of touch on today as well. Automation of common security tasks. That in particular talks to another one of the topics we're going to bring up, which is the staff shortage and staff overload issue. Improving incident response. Of course, everybody wants to be able to respond and resolve incidents as quickly as possible because that reduces risk. And of course, the staffing and securing of emerging architectures are all pretty important. So anyway, I don't know. Do you, Itzik and Bob, you guys want to chime in on any of those?
Sure. So I guess statistics are not surprising to me either. The CISOs I talk to all have the same concern: is that how do they make better decisions regarding their vulnerabilities and risk management programs, and how do they do it in a world of decreasing resources, right? So yeah, these numbers look about right. I'm a little bit surprised about improving security awareness. I think that's always an objective, but it seems like it's something that many are still thinking about.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's pretty consistent.
Yeah, actually, I'll give you a chance to chime in too. But the awareness thing, for me, that's more about the human factor, right? That's the number one risk. Like if you look, it's not in this deck, but one of the top risks around ransomware and the threat vector is email, right? And that's all about training people not to do stupid things, right? So that's what security awareness is really all about, is helping people not do stupid things.
Yeah, I think Bob kind of summarized it all, but I think it is worth noting, back to your comment, Mark, that there is some competing priorities here. Obviously, all these tasks require people to do something, people to configure systems, people to build processes, and again, the shortage of the security talent and the shortage of people working for these companies that needs those types of capabilities, that needs those types of tasks is the challenging. I mean, we all want to improve risk, we all want to improve vulnerability assessment, we all want to come up with different ways to do it, but how much really can we do it with our staff right now, and how much, what we can do to compensate for the fact that we don't have all the people that we need to do those tasks.
Absolutely. Yeah, and actually I just spotted a question that's kind of relevant to this, which is, do you think there'll be a shift in priorities in 2023? I'll let you guys chime in too, but I think, and what we've seen in the past few years with this particular question is there hasn't been a lot of shift. It's really, which is kind of unfortunate because it means that as a vendor community, we're not fixing a lot of these problems, or they continue to persist. I think the staffing problem continues to grow, though, and that kind of ties into automation as well, where obviously if you're having problems recruiting talented staff, then one response to that, outside of trying harder to hire people, but it's automate, and really eliminate some of those common tasks so that the people you do have can concentrate on what's more important. So I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on going forward?
Well, there's two parts to that. When you refer to building staff, there's another part that I hear a lot from CISOs is the increasing cost of cybersecurity, right? I'm amazed myself at what some vendors and products and service providers charge for cybersecurity services and products. And it's not just that there's not enough people. It's becoming very difficult to even buy cybersecurity these days. So what they're trying to do is try to find those products and services, that combination, that gives them the highest value from a cyber perspective at the lowest cost. Because budgets are not increasing both in IT and specifically in cyber. So the CISOs are really having to become cyber economists and really find value. That I hear that time and time again.
Yeah, I think with respect to the upcoming year, I don't think, as we all kind of discussed, we're looking at the same problem. Mark, you made the comment that some of these are repeated things that over the years industries and companies were trying to fix. Unfortunately, we still have to handle with it. And to Bob's point about the budgeting are not being bigger, but the risks are not getting smaller. I will just say that, it's important when we look at this information to separate some high-level topics such as improved risk assessment and securing remote access and work from home. So obviously working from home or remote-first companies are introducing new types of attack vectors or increasing some of the risks. However, this is just a subset of the overall. When we look at things like improved data security, obviously with respect to where data resides on computers and people working from home. So again, I don't think there's any major shift in the threat landscape. These are still the right priorities. I will say that unfortunately, and Bob and I can definitely talk about this in a couple more slides, the economy of ransomware, the economy of other countries, hacking countries, either for profit or for intelligence purposes, we're only seeing increase of it. This is not going to go down. It's only going to go up. It's only going to go bigger. And we can talk about some contributing factors, cryptocurrency, how this can help monetize and how people are making money out of these days from one way or the other. But yeah, we're looking at the same list, and it's all right there, and it's all need to be taken care of, even in 2023. Absolutely.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And one thing is we were just talking that kind of popped into my head too is that whole notion of the expanding attack surfaces with work from home, with IoT, with edge computing. All these things are drastically not only expanding attack surfaces, but also making them more difficult to map, right? And so that's where automation also comes into play, because there's just no way that humans can keep track of all of this. So, and we'll touch on that topic a little bit later on as well. Okay, great. So that brings us to the next polling question. Let's see if I can hit the right button here. Here we go. All right, so think about your security operations team. Those are the folks on your front lines that are dealing with security incidents. And if you could estimate what percentage on a day-to-day basis of the incidents your team cannot investigate in a typical day. So in other words, at the end of the day, when the shift ends or whatever, how many incidents are left over that they haven't been able to get to? And this is just a select one of the 5 options there, between 10 and 100%. So I'll give you guys a few seconds to answer that one. Yeah, and this one's a really interesting topic, because obviously the problem just gets worse as staffing problems increase. Right? So, the less staff you have, unless you can automate and do some of those other things we're just talking about. Okay, give you about another 5 seconds here. All right, let's see here. Okay, so this one is a dead even split between the top, or rather the bottom 3, so between 10% and 60%. So interesting. Okay, so let's look at the data around this. So again, this comes from the 451. We have this series of surveys that we do every year we call Voice of the Enterprise. And in this case, there were 181 people that responded to this. And again, these are all IT decision makers, practitioners that typically work for large organizations, although not necessarily. So in this one, this was kind of a sobering statistic because in this large of a base, 48% of the alerts were unable to be investigated in a typical day. So that falls on the top end of what the survey that we just did showed. Now, obviously, that was a much smaller sample. But what's even more telling, though, and I don't show this on this particular slide, but I went back and I looked at the 2021 data and compared it with the 2022 data. And what that showed was even more sobering, which is that in 2021, between 2021 and 2022, that number increased 7.3 percentage points. So that's 18% year over year. So in other words, this year, they're unable to investigate 18% more than they were last year. So we're going backward in that. And again, I think from my perspective, it's a combination of things. Again, it's the staff issues, not only staffing issues or recruiting issues, but also there's particular pain points around recruiting and retaining senior analysts, and that dovetails into automation very tightly because, again, if your shortage is particularly on the upper end of that analytical spectrum, where it's the senior analysts that know enough to know where to look and how to rapidly resolve incidents. The junior folks, though, don't have that option in many cases. And so if we can kind of supplement what they're doing with analytics and with automation and you just remove a lot of those kind of that bottom maybe 20 or 30% of incidents so that they don't have to deal with those, and obviously that helps the situation. Anyway, so you guys want to chime in at all on that?
Sure. So I'm not surprised by this statistic. Obviously, it says, in your number, 52%, they were able to investigate. The number, to me, is less important. What's more important is, are they investigating the right events, right? That, to me, is really the critical one. I go into a number of companies, and I do these assessments, and I talk to their operations group. And, they literally do these incident investigations as they come in. Two important points. Number one, they might not be working on the most critical one. And they might not, their tools and their, as you said, your skill level might not be at a point for them to understand the relationship between the various incidents. So numbers really don't mean a lot to me. I'm more concerned when I look at these programs in these organizations. Are you actually looking at the ones that have a real, a critical impact to your company, to your organization? And I'll be honest with you, I've not been optimistic. I mean, as a result of what I've seen, I can't be very optimistic about what I see from security operations.
Yeah, I want to, I think Bob raised the most important question here, which is, I agree, it's not the number, it's the prioritization method, right? Because I think that even the most sophisticated, well-staffed organization could never achieve a 100%. And I think, Mark, you said it yourself, the explosion of IoT devices, edge computation, and just in general, how scaling through cloud and other means is allowing companies today to rapidly create more infrastructure. It's just naive to assume that the company can then hire the same amount of analysts or bring something to handle this. So Mark, you mentioned automation, and Bob mentioned prioritization. I think the secret sauce, so to speak, is the combination of both of them, right? It's first, you have to understand your threat landscape. You have to understand what you're defending against and where's your crown jewels. Because as Bob said, if you're doing first in, first out, you might be handling some incident on a QA server, ignoring your production and where the real crown jewels are. So prioritization is key. And then, Mark, to your point here about automation, yeah, I mean, some of those things could be false positives. I mean, some of those things could be misalerts, could be just, your backup software woke up at midnight, start creating some VPN connection. You might be thinking that's the Russians. In reality, it's just your monthly backup solution trying to back up your systems, right? So there's a lot here that basically we can work smarter to achieve the end game. And I think this number is just, it's a bigger cry out to understand that the problem won't be solved by brute force. It needs to be done in a different way.
Yep.
Yeah, agree. And I'll give you a real life example. I do a lot of ransomware investigations while they're happening or before or after. And what I try to explain to the SOCs, to the analysts as well is, if you focus on the events that relate to privileged account attacks and exploitation and the whole lateral movement, you'll be in a much better position to identify potential ransomware events and malware events than anything else. But yet, the way their strategies work, it's kind of everything is equal, right? They don't understand priorities in risk. And people say, well, do you do threat assessments? Everyone says yes, but then no one actually does or applies it. So you really need tools to help you understand if your real risk, from example, is ransomware. If your real risk is privilege attack exploitation, account exploitation, you got to focus your efforts there. But I'll be honest with you, I don't see a lot of that happening.
Yeah, and I think both of you hit on a really important topic, which is the concept of risk, right? So say you've got 100 incidents every day that you need to deal with. How do you know which are the most important, right? The quantity is not as important as, and Bob, you really hit on this, is not as important as knowing which ones are the most important. In other words, the riskiest, the most potential business impact. And it's that quantification of risk that really becomes important. So that's one thing. But then, and it's a complaint right into your hand here. But, I think the other thing is that if you can eliminate those incidents or the probability that those are going to happen in the first place through testing, right? And close those gaps before they actually turn into an alert, then that's going to help it too, right? It's particularly if you can do that, on a continuous basis, which is kind of the theme of this whole thing, right? Is if you can, check, look for chinks in that armor and do it on a repeatable basis, so that you're healing yourself before somebody sneaks in and it creates an alert, then that's huge.
I think we'll touch upon it in a couple of more slides, Mark. But I think just to kind of reiterate the importance of what you just said. A lot of times when you're in our industry, we praise real-time detection, real-time threat analysis. But honestly, real-time is being head-to-head with the adversary. Real-time means that there is two people competing, and usually the adversary will find a sneaky way to hide, to basically jump to a different machine, and then we're going to lose track. We're naively going to assume this will be a game over, that we cut the adversary, that we put the right rules. And I think, as you said, being ahead of the time here is really the asymmetrical type game breaker, not to be in real time, to do things ahead of the time. But we'll get to it in a few slides. Yeah,
and that speaks to being proactive versus reactive, right? I want to be proactive on this kind of thing. So, okay. All right, well, let's jump into the last survey poll question, and this is going to take us into ransomware. So again, I should remind everybody, don't be afraid to answer these questions. We're not tracking you, we're not going to, associate your answer with your name and publish this information. I think it just all disappears once we turn off the session here. So anyway, we're going to segue into ransomware. And so here's the next question. So if your organization, or if it was affected by ransomware, which of the following outcomes likely occur or occurred? So one was, the first one is, did your endpoint or would your endpoint security tools interrupt the attack? Would you have to pay the ransom? Would your network security tools interrupt it? Would you have to re-image machines and restore? Maybe use a previously broken publicly available encryption key to decrypt it. You could re-image the machine, but likely the data would be lost. Or could you break the encryption key that was used to encrypt it in the first place, enabling decryption? And again, this is either, if you were to have that experience, or if you have had that experience, either one. And pick as many of those as would be applicable. I'll give you another few seconds here. While we're doing that, let me scan for some questions here. Okay. All right, moving right along here. All right, so 100% of the folks felt that endpoint security tools would interrupt the attack, and then we had kind of an even split between paying ransom, the network security tools, and reimaging. Okay, so let's look at what our data showed. Okay, and so again, this came from our Voice of the Enterprise survey in 2022, and this is our endpoint security survey. In this case, only 25% of the folks felt that their endpoint security tool would interrupt the attack, which is maybe low. I've seen maybe as high as 40%, but in general, endpoint security tools, and of course that happens with ransomware, where the ransomware authors are getting more and more clever at obfuscating their code and whatnot. That in combination of what they're calling signature-less or 0 days, right, where there isn't any metrics around this, there's no signatures to match and that kind of thing. So it just makes it even more nefarious to stop it at the endpoint. Surprisingly, almost 22% said they paid the requested amount. So this is where these are people that have actually experienced ransomware attacks. So these are real data from real events. So 22% paid the requested amount. One thing I've noticed over the past couple of years is that while organizations seem to be increasingly paying that amount, mainly because it's a time to restore kind of thing. If you're taking your entire company down, is it worth the 10 million or whatever you're paying? And Bob, I'll let you chime in on this because I know you're doing a lot of this. Is it worth it versus trying to restore, and all that kind of thing? And the other trend that I've seen is that cyber insurance companies are decreasingly paying those claims, right? So you've got sort of that offset. I'm sure, Bob, you got a lot of experience around that. Network security, another way, but again, a lot of times, unless it's behavioral based, network security is again looking for either TTPs, techniques, tactics, and procedures, or they're looking for signatures or whatever to try to block it. So that's, again, just partially effective. And the rest of it's all about restoration, right? Reimaging and so on. So anyway, okay, I'll let you guys chime in.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll be honest with you. I've worked now 8 ransomware incidents while they're occurring, as I said, and then mostly after. Only about 20% of those 8 actually were detected in any way, whether it was an endpoint detection tool or a network detection tool or some analytic tool that was looking at the data from all events. And those are companies who had both traditional antivirus and malware protection, all the way through to companies who had the most sophisticated, EDR, XDR, whatever R they call it these days, but the whole range of tools. The big ransomware targets, especially the ones I've recently worked in the medical industry, they are using either modified payloads that are known, and they'll basically make certain changes to them to obscure them, or they are in fact 0 days. So I think we have to be a little careful. CISOs need to be careful when their consideration is that, well, I have the best endpoint detection tool and it's going to prevent an attack. Well, that's not statistically what I'm seeing. What I'm also seeing is that not only are these attacks becoming more difficult to identify, they're becoming more sophisticated in actually what they do. Not the last one, but one of the previous ones I've worked, they literally made themselves members as they broke into the directory service. They made themselves members of the backup data group. Well, guess what? Your data now is your backup data, since no one was paying attention to it for the last, in this case, 2 months, was all being run through their engine and their encryption algorithm, which was ciphering the backups. So they had some degree of backups, but it was now becoming the grandfather of the grandfather, and a lot of that data wasn't as useful as what they needed. And they knew exactly when to pull the pin and announce themselves right. So to optimize. So they're becoming very, very good. So you really do need better endpoint detection tools. We're seeing some come onto the marketplace now that are focused specifically on ransomware attacks. But I think that's something that we need to think more about. And yeah, the ones I work with, I'll tell them, and that's 21.7%. Yep, you need your data back. And the ones I work with is I tell them you got to pay to get your data back, and they all do. They all, they're very good at and diligent at helping you get your data back, including helping you actually do the backup. I think these statistics are not that surprising, except for the endpoint detection, not your number, but the number that the attendees denoted.
Right.
Yeah, I'd like to add. Bob is giving us the reality check, and that there's nothing else to be said except that what he's saying is indeed the unfortunate situation. I want to bring perhaps an adjacent angle to that, and this is that a lot of these tools also have the complexity of configuring them. You might be buying the best product out there at a given point in time, but a misconfiguration of that product, the policies, the engine, the threshold, even the location of the deployment, you might be thinking, okay, this is the right network tools to be put in this junction, not understanding do you perhaps have alternative network traffics and route. Again, we're all going to go back to this concept that complexity is what killing companies out there. The complexity is also where adversaries can find loopholes and misconfiguration and etc. So as Bob mentioned, even having the best tools or even understanding what are the best tools for the job, there's also the human factor of are you configuring, are you utilizing, are you consuming the alerts in a good fashion, right? Because these tools on their own might not even have the sophistication to stop everything. They would raise a flag when they see the attackers. They understand it, but then a human element needs to kick in. And again, we're all talking about this is everything here happens in real time. These people, Bob mentioned a case where it was 2 months they were in the system, adding themselves to different groups, acting as different people within the company for 2 months, right? Who were looking at the event, who understood this ahead of the time. And I think, again, we can talk about how we can build better mousetraps and perhaps how we can stop some of these in the future, but we can also ask ourselves, why are we trying to handle this in real time? Why aren't we trying to understand, as Bob mentioned previously, if you understand that ransomware is in your cards, if your company is going to be affected by a ransomware, you should be thinking about this right now. You should be simulating against this threat right now, because it's just a matter of time. And in that real time, in that madness that happens, all these tools needs to act togetherly, cohesively. What are the chances everything would work in your favor?
Yes. Yeah, I just want to emphasize that's a great point. Real life story. I worked with one company who was very impressed with themselves that they bought one of the sophisticated XDR products, and they bought it, they installed it, they were happy with their 100% installation, and then they configured it to work just like their traditional malware product, and didn't turn on any of the quote X of the extended feature set, right, that does more of the analytics and does the comparison across intelligence databases and between other devices on the network, right? They just wanted to make it work like their other antivirus did. And guess what? Didn't find the ransomware.
One really interesting thought that just popped into my head, it's because you were talking, is around configuration drift. And that notion where, if you've got, it doesn't matter how good your analytics are, but if you're not, continually reassessing things will drift, right? And it's that kind of the dwell time, if you will, in between your scans or, whatever you're doing to try to prevent this kind of thing where, that's where your risk, the longer that time goes, the higher your risk goes, because things will drift. Not only, because of potential changes, this especially happens on the endpoints, but also, in other network devices and whatnot. But, also, but as new vulnerabilities are discovered and so on and so forth, so, the less time between those verifications and scans or whatever you're doing, the better, right? And so that brings us right back to that kind of continuous validation concept, which I think is really important. All right, well, let's take a look at the questions here. Oh, there was one interesting question, which more of a point, but, we haven't really talked about cloud yet, and I think one really important thing is that, a lot of times folks tend to concentrate on on-premise, and then they concentrate on cloud, but they don't really think of them together, right? And so that adds and exacerbates the problem with staff overload and so on, because now you've got separate sets of tools for cloud and separate sets of tools for on-premise, and and they're all very different. I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on that consolidation and whatnot?
Yeah, I think it follows the IT trends themselves, right? Today we're in this quote hybrid environment in which you have on-prem and cloud. I do think within 3 to 5 years, because of the economics, all cloud will become more appealing to more CFOs. And at that 5-year point, you'll see very, very little on-prem processing. Even in the financials, they understand, as do the regulators, that cloud's the future. Companies don't want to be in the data processing business any longer. So I think that's going to. So for a period of time now, yes, we're going to have to support cybersecurity in both environments, and that's a pain. That's difficult because the products do work in a sense asymmetrically, right? And they don't work across both local and cloud environments. There's no simple answer. This is just something that we have to live with until we end up, as I think we're going to end up, all in the cloud.
Yeah, I 100% support Bob's answer here, and I'll just bring another data point to the conversation that when you think about traditional data centers and the fact that you have a very designated gateway, computers in the data center are rarely exposed to the internet as is, the story of the cloud is a little bit different. I mean, by definition, assets on the cloud are publicly accessible, and mistakes in configuration and the ability of the adversary and these things that happens today, hackers are scanning, every public cloud IP ranges, just waiting for a minor misconfiguration, even a millisecond of a container going up, for instance, without the proper ACL, and they would pull their entire strength to, try to break into it. So as Bob rightfully, telling us about the challenges supporting both environments, I also think that people need to kind of accommodate to the fact that mistakes in a cloud tends to be more expensive than mistakes in data centers. But the future is the cloud, so we just have to recognize with the good comes the bad, right? There is the good stuff on the cloud, and there's the bad stuff, and that's one of the bad aspects, that clouds are publicly accessible 24/7, and that's what the adversaries knows, as well as the companies are using and relying on them.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing is that, and a lot of people may not realize this, or maybe they do, but our research has also shown that the vast majority of organizations are not single cloud. They're multi-cloud. In other words, multi-vendors. Right. And so that's making the problem even worse, because if you're invested in, say, one cloud vendor security, and then you've got a whole different, situation with another vendor, then again, you've just got this tool sprawl. It's just going crazy. So I think there is an opportunity there for organizations, for vendors, security vendors in particular, to help with that, right? Where, you supporting multiple clouds with a single tool, I think is super important. All right, let's see. Well, let me look at the questions here. And again, folks, if on the line, if you want to put some questions in, please do so at any point. Let's see, we already talked about this one. So that's an interesting one. So we haven't really talked a lot about sort of new legislation, compliance, regulations, and so on. And it seems like, again, you've got the concept where, continuous validation helps directly with security risks and so on, but it also plays into the compliance picture, right? Because obviously, especially in the last few years, there have been some pretty monumental, fines and whatnot levied. There's the threat of jail time. So this has become much more of a boardroom conversation than it used to be, right? So I don't know. Do you guys want to chime in and talk a little bit how continuous validation plays into that arena?
Yeah, 2023, I think we will see increased regulatory interest and regulations, obviously. However, I think a subtle shift is underway from regulating the people who use IT, right? And whether it's the financial market or whomever, I think you'll have some of that. But we're seeing a shift now and interest in actually regulating the people who make IT, right? That, you just can't deliver products with crappy source code. I mean, you got to do some amount of testing and validation, right? And there's increasing interest, at least with some of the people I talk to on the Hill, are saying, we've tried and we tried and we tried, and we're not making a whole lot of success. We've reached our limit on regulating people who use IT. We have to also now talk about the people who produce IT and actually sell it. And the government's taken a lot of this to heart, and they are literally, as I said, addressing this with new regulatory requirements for people who sell to the government. This is hitting mostly in supply chain, but also in other aspects as well. So as that rolls out, I think next year, obviously being able to continuously validate your controls will be an increasingly big part of that.
Yeah, I totally agree with Bob, and the changes in acts like ASBOM and the changes from focusing on running IT to who's producing your IT equipment, or overall your software and what's the impact of it, aka the supply chain impact on you and your customers, is becoming an increasing manner. I think it opens up the idea here, Mark, to a bigger thing, which is different regulatory entities, governments, or all sorts of different organizations are discovering two things, actually. One is that the impact is there, right? I mean, what Bob was just describing about, who's making your IT equipment, who's delivering your software, and the implication that can create in a supply chain. So more and more the impact of getting hacked, and even if you're not the target, you being a supply chain to the target, and the target here can be a government or a big critical infrastructure, is becoming more and more aware that things will end up finding their way into those organizations. So first, the impact is just becoming more and more real and more increased. And the second thing is that, again, through the evolution of the technology, that things that they can start asking, the type of data points. I mean, again, going back to Bob's, questions about crappy source code, right? I mean, the capability right now to ask the vendor to show you the list of open source projects that they're using or relying upon is accessible. In the past, it could be a very hard ask to go and ask big companies to collect all this information. But today they have this information and it's organized and they can share it. I mean, we can have a conversation whether they want to share it or not, but they can share it. And I think this is what's pushing these entities to start demanding more. And we talked about demanding more from being disaster recovery prepared, testing themselves ahead of the time, reporting certain metrics at certain times to different stakeholders. It's no longer become these black box types of mechanisms where things just go in and out at random times. You can start demanding, you can start asking for transparency. And I think this is what we're kind of witnessing. And Bob touched upon it on the source code. Mark, you mentioned insurance companies and the way that they would evaluate companies, superior to insuring them, not on a one-time effort, but a continuous manner. It's just the evolution that, again, big data or data-driven has arrived to our industry as well. Now the regulatories are getting comfortable asking to get these data. The shareholders are getting comfortable asking these data. And I think this is going to help flash out some of the problems. It's not going to help fix them all, obviously. I mean, just recognizing the data points won't change the reality, but it will begin setting a new norm, hopefully a better norm that we have today in our industry, some verticals.
Yeah, I agree. Listen to this. One of my clients is an insurance company, and they recently asked me what I thought from an advising perspective, whether it would be a good idea if they asked their clients to get access to their Git CI/CD pipeline. And I said, "Oh, that's interesting." And I said, "Well, there's I don't know what the customer is going to think about that, but I understand why you want it. But it was interesting that they were asking the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. We could go down a whole other rabbit hole around that third-party risk topic, but there's actually a question here that I think is aimed more at ITSIC, but the question was, and I believe he's talking about, safe breach. He said, how does the tool compare to open source solutions like MITRE, Caldera, Atomic Red Team, et cetera? It might be a good time for you to do a little pitch on what you guys do too.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for the question, Mario, and I'll definitely answer it. So just to kind of prefix it, as I said in the beginning, my name is Isaac Hocker. I'm the co-founder and CTO of SafeBreach. SafeBreach, we're a leader in the breach and attack simulation field with our product, the SafeBreach platform. And Mario here just mentioned a couple of open source projects, namely a few MITRE, Caldera, and Atomic Red Team. And I think what's important to understand is while, SafeBreach, we didn't invent pen testing or offensive testing. These concepts were obviously existing, and there's tools in the market, different open source tool that has some of these capabilities. I think the major difference between the names that were brought in SafeBreach can basically broke down into two major factors. The first one is the SLA around the content. When you rely on an open source project, it's all nice and well, but when you think about having these different attacks being updated in a continuous manner, getting the latest and greatest attacks, there is obviously a gap between what these open source projects can produce in terms of offensive content in a commercial company such as SafeBreach. I think the second thing is obviously the integration that you would expect. Again, these open source projects do have a couple of different integration and supportability, but at large, talking about other commercial security products, SIEM vendors, EDR vendors, etc., you would like the best solution to be able to connect and triage, and this is not always the case with these open source projects. And I think third and not less, again, as with everything here, obviously open source has a great role to play in the software industry and etc. But the level of support, the level of the activity in the project may be varied. When you go with a commercial company, you basically have a dedicated support, SLA, bug fixes, ability to influence the roadmap. And that's obviously something that we provide being a commercial company here. But again, these are great examples for great open source projects that definitely can help you get started on your journey to do using offensive for defensive purposes.
That makes sense. Great. And this one's kind of similar or related, and that is, how effective are traditional security validation tools in measuring the cloud? So bring that into the cloud conversation.
So just to kind of make sure that, we're level set here, I think that, from an offensive perspective, when you talk about, best solutions to measure the efficiency of security controls, I don't think, while the cloud definitely introduced extra layers of complexity, cloud vendors tend to have specific services, like, for instance, Amazon has S3 buckets. Those could definitely be increasing your attack surface. I think at large, BAS capabilities and offensive capabilities operating on a variety of levels, from the network level to the operations system level, and also to include these particular PaaS services, there is not a whole lot of difference. I mean, the solution, the SafeBreach solution, is as effective as helping you secure your cloud, as well as to secure your corporate network and your data centers. The fact that you're moving to a cloud, the fact that the company has, as Bob mentioned, a hybrid, and as you mentioned, Mark, multiple cloud vendors just add to the complexity. But fundamentally, using offensive security to test your defensive measurements is a concept that is valid in the cloud as well as in other environments.
Yeah, one other part of that is what I explained to cyber organizations and CISOs is that it's different. In on-prem, you have full access to the hardware, the kernel, the system software, and yeah, you can see it and test it all. You cannot do that in the cloud. No matter how hard you try, you don't have certain privileges and accesses outside the hypervisor, right? And you don't know anything about the management network that's connecting them all together, right? that various people have access to that you just don't see, because when you signed off on the SLA, it said that they have responsibility for that security, the cloud security provider, and you do everything above that. And they really mean that. And no matter how much you try, either to ask questions or buy tools, you have to understand that when you go to the cloud, you're in a different world, a different environment, and you have to accept some risk, right? And once I tell that to CISOs, they say, "Oh, yeah, okay." They didn't realize that too much before, but now it becomes apparent when they try to do it.
Right. No, that's a great point. You know, you don't own the stack anymore, right? You're dependent on them, and that also plays into kind of the breach and attack simulation hand, which is to say, how much do you trust your cloud providers? Do you want to independently verify, you know, for yourself, you know, how secure those are to whatever extent you can. Obviously, you don't have, the ability to get to all those layers like you can in on-prem, but yeah, makes a lot of sense to me. All right. Just looking here, I think we're pretty much out of questions. Let me just double check and see if there's anything pertinent there. So here's your last chance to enter a question if you haven't already. So I guess, yeah, maybe I'll just start to wrap things up a little bit here. I want to thank you guys. It's been a great discussion. I think, at the end of the day, all of these issues that we talked about, around the security objectives and trends, the fact that, we're not seeing any decreases in risk. If anything, between the expansion of the attack surfaces, we didn't even touch on things like edge and Internet of Things, which even more, in addition to cloud, even increase the attack surface even more, exponentially in many cases. So that's continuing to happen. The number of security incidents are not likely to be going down, although you could make the case that, with better analytics and with better proactive testing, that would affect that. But at the end of the day, I think it's not so much, Bob, to your point, it's not so much the question around how many incidents or what percentage are you able to get to, but are you working on the ones you should be working on, the highest risk ones that would potentially impact the organization. And then lastly, around ransomware, that's such a huge topic for folks, and the fact that that's not going away. It's only getting worse. People are paying increasingly higher ransoms and so on. So that's just getting a lot of mind share, within the security community and the vendor community as well. So I don't know, do you guys have any concluding thoughts you want to throw out there?
I don't. It's okay.
I mean, I just have some again, random thought after, listening to you, Bob, and you, Mark, and I think perhaps I can get all of us to agree on that, or maybe not, but let's see. I think that, it's obvious to me that, in security, we have asymmetrical ratio between the good guys and the bad guys. It's not a symmetric level field where each entity has the same power. Somebody somewhere in the world right now can find a 0 day, and just that particular moment in time, he or she might have asymmetrical power to now perhaps hack or take over companies around the world. I think, what we constantly seeing through the data that you presented today, Mark, that, the struggle is to try to keep up with the adversary. The struggle is to try to keep up with the alert fatigue and try to go one-to-one with every time that something happens. I think, again, the next big thing for us is to try to break this asymmetrical ratio, is to find something to make this asymmetric level field between the good guys and the bad guys. Now, there's a lot of ways and there's a lot of companies and ideas researching into that. And I would just, advise every one of the listeners today and everybody who's watching this great panel to think about security, not just yet another problem, but as an asymmetrical problem, and thinking in solutions in a way that can break this asymmetrical relationship and making it more fair or more leveled field playing for both the good guys and the bad guys. So that's kind of like my parting thoughts here for the discussion.
Agree.
Sounds great. Okay. Well, thanks, guys. It's been a great discussion, and look forward to. I know we've got some more things coming up in the future with you guys, so I appreciate it. And thanks for all the great questions and for everybody that attended today. And again, as I mentioned, we'll be publishing the replay this video, as well as the deck and whatnot, in case you want to share that with others. So with that, I think we'll call it a day. And Aida, I'll let you shut things down. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, Itzik, and Robert. That concludes our roundtable for today. As a reminder, the on-demand version of this event will be available shortly. On behalf of SafeBridge and 451 Research, thank you for attending and have a great day.